We can't get too detailed on all this, but let's see. You've watched a lot of drama unfold up to now. We skimmed through a few million years. You watched Alberta take shape, saw her rivers form, watched her mountains rise, watched as Indians and buffalo became the social order, saw the fur traders and explorers come west and set up forts and a new social order. You saw the whiskey trader's arrival and his hurried departure, and the great march west of the Northwest Mounted Police. Well, now, get set, because there's lots to come. The settling of Alberta has been mainly centered near forts on the North Saskatchewan up to now. Fort Edmonton has seen most of the development. Now, though, there are two events shaping up that are going to bring the South into the center of the stage. In far-off Ottawa, the Fathers of Confederation had been charting out the details of a railroad to reach right across the nation. Now, there were pros and cons as to the routes the new rail lines should follow, but in the end, it's decided that the sparsely settled southern part of Alberta is more favorable for the new railroad than the more heavily populated north near the Battlefords and Fort Edmonton. Meanwhile, in a completely unrelated incident, a colorful Alberta character named Kootenai Brown is selling the idea of free grass on Alberta's foothills to the cattlemen of Montana. Well, this man, Kootenai Brown, he was southern Alberta's first white settler. Actually, he was an Englishman who went wild. His adventures would fill a book. Anyhow, in one way, he was the start of Alberta's cattle industry. Now, the big rancher's day in the sun is about to begin. This is the start of a glamour that continues to ride through Alberta today. The cattlemen and the cowboys who ride for them. When the first herds were trailed up from Montana, they were herded by American cowboys. Some came from as far south as the Texas Panhandle. They were a great bunch. The cowboy of today has little resemblance to these cowhands, other than sharing a love for the outdoors and the caring of cows and horses. The two would barely recognize one another. You get the idea of a long, lean-hipped cowboy with gaily colored batwing chaps and a beautifully shaped, light-colored, wide-brimmed hat set at a jaunty angle. Well, today's cowboy is mostly always seen when he's on show, at a rodeo, or taking part in one. To a working cowboy of the 1880s, he'd be looked on as a real dude. Now, I don't mean today's Alberta cowboy isn't tough. But pickup trucks and fenced-in pastures has sure made cow chasing a different thing than it was in the days of the trail herds in the open range. Now, let's look at the early cowboy. First of all, he came in all sizes and a variety of colors. Whites were predominant, but there were many great black cowhands. Indians were to become great cowboys. And the Mexicans can claim, validly too, that they invented the business. Number two fact about these cowboys is that they had to love what they were doing, else none of them would have done it. Take the real life of a cowboy and the glamour soon disappears. Hit the saddle at daybreak after you've cared for your horse, fed him, watered him, and curried him. Breakfast from the back of a chuck wagon, you can bet there'd be no frills. Remember, you can't keep too much over a period of many days in the back of a wagon under a hot, brassy sky. And then roundup begins. Ride for miles. Comb every draw and coulee and brush pocket. Get them all, and then try and gather them up, and then try and get them moving in the same direction. Never mind the direction you want them to go. Hot, dry, dusty, your horse as tired as you. You finally make camp to sleep in a greasy bedroll under the stars. And that would be the good days. What are the bad ones? When pouring rains turn to sleet, and then the early fall blizzard or the late spring blizzard hit with full force. Well, now you know why they chose Angora goat for their chaps instead of fancy bat wings. If you were too far from camp to make it, you made a dry camp in a brushy coulee, and you shivered there until the weather cleared, and then gather 'em up all over again and head 'em for the camp. You had to understand cows, but you had to love horses. You often had to put your pony's comfort ahead of your own. Many a cowboy has carried the saddle himself and led a footsore cayuse for miles to ease the horse's suffering. And any cowboy will tell you that walking and cowboys don't get along, especially if you're carrying a 40-pound saddle. He was tough, and he was untiring. His hygiene was a little questionable because wrestling calves and trailing herds is not clean work. You bathed when you hit a stream or a river, if the flies and mosquitoes and temperatures would let you, and you generally dined out on a tin mess plate, standing up. Those trail drives were something else again. I'm going to borrow from an old novel here called Log of a Cowboy, and you can hear the trail boss giving advice to the greenhorns on his crew on the morning the drive is to get underway. Boys, the secret of trailing cattle is never to let your herd know that they're under restraint. Let everything that is done be done voluntarily by the cattle. From the moment you let them off the bed ground in the morning until they're bedded at night, never let a cow take a step except in the direction of its destination. In this manner you can loaf away the day and cover from 15 to 20 miles, and the herd in the meantime will enjoy all the freedom of an open range. Of course, it's long, tiresome hours to the men, but the condition of the herd and saddle stock demands sacrifices on our part. And I want to caution you younger boys about your horses. There is such a thing as having 10 horses in your string and at the same time being afoot. Accidents will happen to horses, but don't let it be your fault. Keep your saddle blankets dry and clean, for no better word can be spoken of a man than that he is careful of his horses. In such emergencies as we're liable to meet, we have not a horse to spare, and a man afoot is useless. Well, those tough, wiry men of the saddle came. They came driving huge cattle herds ahead of them. Losses were heavy for the early cattlemen, but there was a determination among those first cattlemen that kept them coming. Each herd needed cowboys, and some stayed on. Others drifted in on their own. Soon, many big outfits were becoming well established. The grass was good, and shelter and water was abundant. Seemed everything that a cattleman wanted. But there was a head-on collision coming, and it started in the form of 2 ribbons of steel from the east. While the dusty cattle drives have come from the south, under the eyes of their sun-browned, leather-toughed drovers, a different breed of sinewy, hammer-swinging men have been laying the track at a rate of 5 or more miles a day, and the collision came smack at Fort Calgary in 1883. Cowmen and the railway, no, that wasn't bad, because it gave the cattlemen an easy access to eastern markets. But, and this is what hurt, it brought in settlers by the thousands. They came from eastern Canada, from Europe, from the United States, and they brought barbed wire and plow points. They fenced off their quarter sections, and the cattlemen could only fume in frustration. Eventually, Alberta's cattle industry learned to live with barbed wire, as did cattlemen everywhere, but the process did not come without some bitterness on the part of settlers and cowhands. The cowboys that came in with the early drives soon found eager students for their trade, and a meld of farm boy and cowboy helped bring an uncomfortable but livable truce between the two factions. Now the trains are coming more rapidly. Every one brings settlers. You can see them stepping off the train there at Calgary. Most of them recognize that they're not in prime farmland. They've traveled for nearly 1,000 miles over windswept prairie, hardly a tree in sight, and their weary faces and tired eyes can't help but show a dejection that seems out of place for the spirit and determination that they're going to need. But there's the landman to greet them and give them a new hope. You can practically hear him now as he points farther north. Up the Edmonton Trail, that's where they'll find it, only another 60 or 70 miles. Why, there's trees for shelter and creeks and springs on nearly every quarter. It's the follow me to prosperity kind of talk, and you can see the optimism starting to take the sag from tired shoulders and put the light back into the newcomer's eyes and the smile back on his lips. For many, it wasn't a matter of blind trust. They had to make it. They had everything on the line, and there was nowhere to go but ahead. Well, the Edmonton Trail did lead to everything the landmen could promise, and more. But it had to be tamed. The trees chopped, the land broken, the roots picked. Start with a shelter, a log hut, a sod shanty, a dugout on the bank of a coulee. Some started with a wagon box turned upside down and then built from there. Sweat, heat, cold. Mosquitoes, black flies, horse flies. Creeks in flood. Hail, thunder and lightning storms. Runaways, survey pegs you couldn't find. It was miles for supplies, and when a husband left, it may be for days. A lonely wife must have had many terror-filled nights as the harmless but fierce-sounding coyote packs yodeled outside the flimsy walls. And then the winter came, so cold it crackled in the night. Blizzards that raged for days at a time. The desperate job of caring for the livestock without adequate hay and shelter. If there was a creek for water, the ice was 2 or 3 feet thick. If it was a slough, it sometimes froze right to the bottom. If it was a well, the pump would be frozen. Melt snow for the house and haul water from somewhere for the cattle. As you watch these earliest newcomers to this harsh new land, you wish you could reach down and help. Whatever the odds, though, you'll always find some who can see a hope ahead. They support those around them. Many times a wife would be able to lend hope to a husband who might have broken. Often it went the other way. Sometimes it was a neighbor that sensed the despair and with a visit and a fresh-baked loaf of bread or a pie could ward off the despair and make room for the courage that the troubled family needed to carry on. It was tough for the earliest ones. Breaking the land was the toughest of all. A man with an axe, facing an acre of tall poplar trees. Well, it was one at a time. No wonder they became great axemen. No wonder they made every stroke count. The good ones made a deep cut on one side of a row of trees and then waited for a wind to come and lay the trees down for limbing, topping, and piling. You cut your own wood and pile burned the rest. And finally you hook onto the stumps, one at a time with whatever power you had. Some used a horse and a cow hooked together. The lucky ones had oxen. They were best of all. Some tried pulling stumps with a balky team. That could bring tears of frustration to the toughest man's eyes. And when you finally got a chunk cleared, you had to break it. The roots seemed like an impossible network, and they all had to be pulled and piled and burned. You pulled and you chopped, and then you did it again. Every square foot was a fight, and it was back-breaking work. Then there was hay to be put up with a scythe. In the hottest days of July and August, a man worked from dusk to dawn. He paused now and then to draw a stone from a hip pocket and hone the blade, and then back to his work. Well, no wonder you feel an empathy for these men and women of Alberta's parklands. Look, though. Help is on the way. New neighbors are coming. They arrive almost daily now. The flood of these newcomers has reached its crest, and even the most miserable jobs become bearable because others are finally here to share the task with you. Thousands of stories can be told of the parkland settlers. Further south or east, it's a different kind of homesteading. Here the blizzards and the winds have double impact. See the wire from the house to the barn? Well, that's there out of respect for the blinding blizzards of winter. Before they started doing that, many a life was lost. Breaking the land was easier, but the rains came less frequently. Water was harder to come by, and shelter was hauled from the treed areas to the west. Some sawmills are set up now. Wagon trains of supplies make trips shorter. You can feel that the settlers are winning. Oh, life isn't much easier, but they know, too, they're winning, and now they're proud of what they've done, immensely proud. Now, finally, there's a little time for some fun. There's baseball, hockey, soccer, and rodeos for the men and boys, and the women have quilting bees, socials, showers, and then together, couples can enjoy dances in the schoolhouse Christmas party. The war came too early. Men who were only beginning to get their land settled turned their walking plow on its side and shouldered arms. Fuzzy-cheeked farm boys who should have just been entering the joys of adolescence were forced to manhood. Their performance on the field of battle was immense, but the cost was terrible. But the job was finally over, and the triumphant winners came home, some limping, some in poor health, all aged beyond their years, but they came home to pick up where they'd left off. Wherever you look now, there's activity. Building, land clearing, lumbering, cattle herds growing, roads being built, railroads being finished, telephones making distances short, windmills everywhere to make work easier, even wind chargers and electricity, motor cars, coal mines, oil wells being developed. A fishing industry has emerged, and at Edmonton, a strange breed of men were flying fish out and mail into the far north. There's a terrible cloud on the horizon now. It's dust. 10 years of depression and low prices. 10 miserable, heart-wrenching years of poverty, tears, broken dreams. Foreclosure becomes a common word. The brightest hopes are dashed. Men and women who have survived the toughest odds will break now. Minds beset with the failures they see on every side will crack. This is Alberta's and Western Canada's darkest hour. You and I'll probably not fully understand how the Depression and that desperation could be solved by war. Even the weather, though, seemed to respond to the call to war. For with the opening rounds being fired, the West saw the searing winds give way to blessed rains. Once again, Canada went to war, and Albertans again more than played their part. Well, you've pretty well watched it all. The rest is so recent it isn't as much fun to review as it was, and besides there's an awful lot to see that we've had to miss. Let's look again, one last loving look together at our province. Start with the magnificence of our mountains, the raw power of our rushing rivers. Look across our thousands of acres of towering timber. Look to our marvelous Peace River country. Notice the nodding oil pumps in forest clearings, in mountain slopes, and in the peaceful pastures and gentle grainlands. Look to the northeast, where massive machinery and mighty plans are poised to assault a wealth of energy from the black of the tar sands. See our coal fields? An almost unending reserve. Alberta beef, standing knee-deep in the alfalfa fields of our irrigation country. From Writing on Stone Provincial Park by our good Montana neighbors to Wood Buffalo Park, bordering on the Northwest Territories. Look at her. Splendid in her thousand moods and colors, rich in her history, unbounded in her future. Of course you love her too. I adore her. Whether you look onto the busy streets of her modern, bustling cities, or the peaceful pastoral settings of her farms or ranches, you swell with pride for this gracious, kindly province. Yes, Alberta, you are a lady, and we love you. You have given us much. Most of all, you've given us the parents who know you best, the pioneers who sought and finally earned your favors. God grant, Alberta, we may always use you as you would have us to do.